Well, I'm not going to go through the whole introduction again for everyone who probably heard it before, but again, we're so excited to have both of you here. And, I wanted to actually start by turning it over to you again. Like I said, we're just honored to have two women with such incredible backgrounds to share your expertise and recommendations. But before we get into Furticom, I'd love to just hear more about your professional paths and your inspiration to work in infertility and reproductive health.
So do you want me to go first, Liz? Because I'm so much older.
Whoever started first, go first.
My parents actually went through primary and secondary infertility. So it took them, I think, 7 years to get pregnant with my older sister, and then another 5 years to get pregnant with me. And in fact, with my sister, I think after about 7 years of trying, my mom's OB-GYN gave her the equivalent of Valium, and boom, there came my sister. And then 5 years later, I came along. And so my entire life, my mom talked about how stressful it was to go through infertility, how my father didn't get it, how all of her friends were having 4 or 5 kids, and how horrible and isolated and terrible she felt. And so it clearly sort of permeated into me, the stress of infertility, the mind-body connection with fertility, and that's what really launched my interest in the field.
Wow, thank you.
For me, I was doing my internship at the Manhattan VA, and a friend and colleague at the time was going through treatment. And so I sort of watched what she was going through, and she happened to be building her family with the help of the people at Cornell, who were just up the street from us. And I knew I wanted to focus on women's health. I wasn't sure what aspect of women's health I wanted to get into, but watching her personal struggle really, led me in that direction. And I was lucky enough to do my fellowship at Cornell, and then was hired. And over 20 years later, I'm still there. Probably will remain the rest of my years. So.
That's such an incredible place. I've spent a lot of time there personally. And so thank you for that. And so tell us all about Furticom, how that evolved, how you guys connected, figured out the need for a resource like this, and just how uniquely it supports those struggling to conceive throughout their journey.
Well, it was one of these bizarre things which really did not involve alcohol. So it really did. I had not drunk anything that night. So I was on the board of Resolve, the National Fertility Organization, and I had just convinced, conned, cajoled, begged Liz to join. And every year Resolve has a fundraising event in New York called Night of Hope. And so we were both at the event, and this is probably 5 years ago. And at the end of the event, where people are still drinking except for us, Liz came up to me, and I've known Liz forever. We've been colleagues, and there aren't very many of us in this field, so we know each other well. And she said, "Have you ever thought about creating an app?" And I'm like, okay, not sure I know what an app is. Like, I don't think I have any on my phone. And so we literally sat down, like we pulled out a Resolve Night of Hope napkin, which I don't know if Liz still has. One of us should have it somewhere.
You should have it framed.
We should have it framed, absolutely. And the two of us sat down and designed the app. And in fact, exactly as it is right now.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I'll just add that the inspiration for it for me was that I had so many clients coming in talking about all the apps they were using to try and relax through the infertility process. So they were using, all the great apps that are out there, mindfulness and Headspace and Calm and all these amazing apps, but not specific to fertility. So that's when I approached Allie, given all of her research and the books that she'd already written, and said, this is kind of crazy that we don't have something specific for our field, because it really is so specific, the stressors that are felt by all the people joining us today. So we didn't want them to just generic relaxation apps. We have something that was really created just for them.
And how
so probably about a month later, it happened that we both were in Chicago for different reasons, and we happened to have a half day. And what we realized was, for our patients, there are so many situations where they have distress in the moment. Like they're at work and their doctor's office calls with negative pregnancy test results, or they're at a friend's house on day 27 of their cycle and they go into the bathroom and they see blood, or they're at a family event and their little sister out of the blue announces she's pregnant. And we came up with 50 of those scenarios based on all the years and years we've been working with patients. And so we thought, what we're going to do is we came up with 50 scenarios which we perceived were the most stressful for our patients, and then came up with solutions to help someone feel better in that moment.
Yeah, and I mean, that's incredible. So it's really based on your data from all of the patients that you've seen and then those in your life over the years, right? That's how you prioritize the 50. And I think that's the perfect segue into just, there are so many triggers, like you said, and so many really specific scenarios that you go through when trying to build your family through, fertility treatments. And so we've selected several that Furticom covers that we'd love to discuss. Also, some that we've heard from our followers that have come up with us as well. And so we'd love to actually go through each of those and hear from you directly just about your recommendations for coping techniques in the moment. Sound good?
Sure.
So I'd love to start with one we hear often, which is when friends or family give unsolicited advice. Sometimes it can come off as disapproving or cruel, or just whether it's obviously completely unintentional in most cases, but how to navigate that.
I mean, why don't I just introduce the breakdown of the different categories, Allie, and then you can maybe jump in.
Sure.
People that are here with us today understand the way Furticom is structured. If you haven't already downloaded it, we talked about the 50 situations that cause stress, one of which you just mentioned is a common one, dealing with friends and family who say potentially inappropriate things, although well-intended. We break
hopefully well-intended.
Hopefully, not all the time. Hopefully, that's too. And so we broke it down into different categories. So if you're on the app and you press on that very situation you just mentioned, you would be led to different options. One would be how to deal with negative thoughts. So, one of the thoughts may be, how can my sister be so insensitive and not understand that what she just said was so hurtful, right? Or no one understands me. Friends and family don't understand me. Mm-hmm. And then you behavioral solutions. So what can you do in that moment to either distract yourself, get out of the situation, or, make yourself feel better so you're not feeling so vulnerable. And then the third one would be, our favorite one, solutions, which then breaks down into, you can have sort of a polite response, a response that helps to educate the person saying the inappropriate thing, or more of sort of the sarcastic, comment back, more of a zinger where you're kind of like putting it back on them for being inappropriate. And then there's another couple categories. One is humor, because if you can't find the humor in all this, you're not going to get through it. Mm-hmm. And the last one is self-nurturing things that you can do for yourself. So every one of those 50 situations that causes stress would then be broken down into all these different options. Mm-hmm. So if you're more of like a cerebral thinker and you want to deal with negative thoughts, you could go there. If you're more of a, how do I set boundaries with people around me, you would go there. Or if you just want to get a laugh, you could go to the humor section. Oh, and I'm forgetting the
relaxations. Yeah.
So there's 12 recorded relaxation techniques. There's minis that are shorter versions, and then there's 5 longer version relaxation techniques. So if you just want to go hide in the bathroom and put your earbuds in and listen to something that helps you kind of recalibrate and center yourself before you go back out to your sister that made the rude comment, you can just do that as well.
I think one of the reasons that we added the social solutions, which I think are Liz and my favorites, is because I don't know about you guys, but I'm somebody, if someone says something rude or insensitive to me, it takes me 3 days to come up with what I should have said. And we have a pretty good sense of the insensitive things that our patients hear way too often. And so, as Liz says, sometimes you just want to be polite. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you want to educate people so maybe they won't hurt the next person who's going through this. I think one of the biggest potential issues is pregnancy loss. I was just reading, I think it was on Facebook this morning, that 2 senators or congresswomen have put forth funding that if somebody has a pregnancy loss, they get sick time. Because I don't remember if it was on the Today Show, whatever, but they were saying that, currently if somebody has let's say, God forbid, a miscarriage tomorrow, you'd be expected to go to work on Friday. Mm-hmm. And as somebody who personally has had a miscarriage, I can tell you there's no way physically or psychologically that somebody should go back to work right away. It can be a tremendous psychological and physiological impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been seeing companies also make announcements about adding that to their benefits, which is obviously their prerogative. And I think that's, an important and incredible benefit to add. So,
but I think with miscarriage, I think that's when there's the most potential to say things that, as Liz said, are hopefully well-meaning, but often can come across as extraordinarily hurtful.
And so what are some of those more specific techniques if someone kind of says something that really hurts you after a miscarriage, that you would recommend?
Like a comment would be like, oh, well, at least you got pregnant, so you should be able to get pregnant again right away, right? It shouldn't be, right? That's something.
What I hear the most of it, well, it was God's will.
Yeah.
And like, honestly and truly, that's not helpful. That's not helpful to anybody. And so, what a person who's had a loss wants to hear is, I am so sorry. What do you need? What can I do to support you? I feel, that's what people need to hear. They don't need to hear, oh, well, maybe you drank alcohol, or maybe you shouldn't have gone running, or maybe you shouldn't have had a fight with your mother-in-law. None of those things are, you're in effect blaming the victim.
Right.
And I think when we designed the Furticom app, we wanted it to be very, not just self-nurturing, but sort of self-protective. So, 1,001 ways how to not go to a baby shower. I mean, I tell all my patients, you were under doctor's orders not to go to baby showers, unless you want to. Obviously, if you want to go to baby shower, go. But that's just asking for trouble for someone to have to sit there and watch somebody open baby gift after baby gift after baby gift.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the questions we had that we wanted to talk about. So, sort of during that baby shower and announcement season, both dealing with the barrage of social media, of seeing announcements from, friends or family who conceive easily, and or being invited to events like baby showers that you just don't have the emotional capacity for. What are some of the techniques that you recommend for kind of dealing with that and coping?
I recommend not going to baby shower. I mean, as I said, unless it's your sister or someone that you're super close to. So, I mean, before the pandemic, it was really easy that I would instruct all my patients the morning of the shower to develop a stomach bug. Okay. And, if you have a stomach bug, nobody wants you anywhere near them. The problem with the pandemic is so many baby showers were remote. And so it's really tough to have a stomach bug and not be able to attend. So, I was just talking to a patient on this morning about this. I'm not somebody who coaches people to lie, but infertility constitutes an enormous crisis. I mean, I and other people have published research showing that women with infertility have the same level of anxiety and depression as do. Paper a few months ago showing at the height of the pandemic, our infertility patients still rated infertility as more stressful than the pandemic. So we know how huge a hit infertility is. And I think we're trying to help our patients be self-protective. And so I will say that, little falsehoods are not a bad thing.
And self-care is not the same as selfishness. I think, a lot of people confuse, like, well, I don't want to be selfish. I should really go to the baby shower. I'm not the kind of person that doesn't support the people I love. I don't want to be looked at as that kind of person. But self-preservation and self-care are very different than being a selfish person. And as people do this, being self-protective, practicing self-care is so much more important to survive this process.
Yeah, you worry about women feeling guilty about being selfish because we just blame ourselves. But so
what I was going to say is that, for example, you still should, if you're not going to get a baby shower, still send a gift, but don't go to a baby store. Go to Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com or your independent bookstore and choose the books that you liked as a kid. Like, for example, I loved Arnold the Purple Crayon, and I loved Blueberries for Sal. And, people love getting books because they're going to use them for years, and just send all your favorite books. Mm-hmm. You're being self-protective. There's nothing selfish about that. You're being self-protective. And it's really important. So what I was going to say before is, infertility is a temporary crisis. You're not going to be infertile or going through this the rest of your life. And so during this hopefully short phase of your life, you need to be as caring and protective of yourself as you possibly can.
And all these, if it's helpful to structure it more in the app, how this would all fit in, we're basically covering all the categories. But if you say, like, well, how would you do with baby showers? And you pressed on the negative thought one, a typical negative thought would be, I don't want to be perceived as selfish. I'm not the kind of person that doesn't show up for my friends. And then the more balanced way would be, this is a temporary crisis. I'm being self-protective in the moment so that I can survive what I'm going through. The behavioral suggestions, some of what Allie was saying, send a gift, pick out a nice card. If it's on a Zoom, pop into the Zoom, and then all of a sudden you lose your internet. You can't be on it. And then the social solutions would be, the polite thing would be to send an email to the person and saying, listen, I'm going through a really tough time in my life right now. You don't even have to disclose what it is if you want to be private about it. Mm-hmm. And that I couldn't be happier for you, but I just can't be there right now. So there's lots of, different ways to approach it. And the app would have all those different solutions in there. So it's packed full of many of the suggestions we're talking about. Very just
right. Got it.
And basically, Liz and I sort of pulled our brains. And if I had a patient in my office who was invited to a baby shower, this is what I would talk to her about. Mm-hmm. Like, what do you want? What do you need? How can you be self-protective? And that's, I've had so many patients who've gotten the app say, it's 11 o'clock on a Saturday night and they get their period. And they can find that exact situation on the app and figure out, even if it's simply doing a relaxation for 15 minutes, to bring down their level of anxiety.
Yeah, it's not a substitute for therapy, but the way we see it as, it's sort of like having your therapist in your pocket at all times, right? Yeah. All the things that we counsel people and tell people to do in sessions are in this app. And again, not a substitute, obviously, for counseling, but the suggestions are there.
Yeah, and I'd love to get to a couple other scenarios we talked about, which are, one of them, well, you just said like getting your period, but what about just receiving, unwelcome or disappointing test results from your physician? You might get a call at work or, or in the office. Like, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about each of the different types of ways to kind of cope with that based on what works best for someone.
One of the 6 categories are called cognitive strategies, because nobody is as mean to you as your own mind. And so if your doctor's office calls and says, we only see 4 follicles on an ultrasound, what you hear is not there are 4 follicles on an ultrasound. What you hear is, oh my God, the cycle's not going to work. I'm never going to have a baby. I'm never going to be happy. And your mind just goes into these catastrophic gloom and doom steps. Yeah. And so the idea of cognitive strategies is to stop yourself and say, okay, for example, right now I have 4 follicles. I'll take my medication today. Let's see how I'm doing in 2 days. And just sort of stick with here and now and not allow that sort of domino catastrophic thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the behavioral strategies could be so many. It could be go listen to a relaxation technique right now on the app just to kind of calm yourself down. Mm-hmm. Distraction. I mean, distraction, we all use it and we all think it's bad, and it doesn't necessarily have to be bad. Distraction, go take a walk, go read a book, go watch a movie, go take a nap, go, call a friend. Sometimes you need to just move away from the intensity of whatever it is that you're feeling.
Yeah. When Shades of Grey came out, that was really great. That was, for about a year or two, I would tell my patients, when you're really feeling like you need a distraction, go read what I would call a slutty novel.
Yeah. A guilty pleasure shouldn't have a stigma. I mean, if it's healthy for you as a distraction,
absolutely,
then you need to do what you need to do. And we're hearing it from the experts. And I actually wanted to get back to the one about it giving, when you get unsolicited advice that could come off as kind of cruel or just not understanding at all. What are some approaches to respond in a way that maybe helps educate the person so they don't do it again, just so they understand your situation better, if you feel comfortable enough doing that?
I think part of it depends on whether or not you want to disclose what you're going through. Mm-hmm. I mean, if your, nosy 85-year-old aunt says, when are you going to make me a great aunt? You can use humor. You can, one of my patients always, when someone asks, we're waiting to see how the dog turns out. I mean, you can use humor. If you want to educate somebody, but maybe not an 85-year-old, but if someone says, when are you going to have a baby? I think you could say something like, it's not as easy for some of us as it is for others. Or you can say, actually, we're seeing a physician for fertility issues. I mean, it depends how forthcoming you want to be. Mm-hmm. I mean, most people with infertility don't feel comfortable talking about it.
And I was going to say, it definitely depends on the person and the relationship, right? I mean, that's your best friend from childhood, and it's worth investing the time to really sit down and say, listen, I have to tell you, when you said that, I know you were trying to, show that you were cared for me and you had concern, but it didn't land well, and here's why,
Right.
and explain, versus the person at the grocery store who says something, or at work, or the mother-in-law who you've always had difficulties with, who is never going to change. You may, that's where you may be self-protective, and you may decide it's not worth my energy to try and educate this person who's not going to change. Instead, it may be better for me to put a boundary of protection around me so that I don't continue to get hurt by this person. So it depends on the circumstance, the context, the person, how open you're going to be, like Allie was saying.
How do you help prepare yourself to put that boundary up if you think it might be coming? You're going to a family event and you get asked this kind of thing.
So I have this thing called snappy comeback lines. So I'll suggest to my patients that they think of the comments that hurt them the most.
Right.
And sort of memorize, either use the social solutions on the app or just, memorize some self-protective things. And it could be simply like, I don't feel like discussing it right now. Or, I've had patients, if someone says something intrusive, like, excuse me, did you really just say that to me? Or do you really think that's supposed to make me feel better? I mean, when we originally wrote the social solutions, there was a third category called zingers, which I personally thought was the best part of the app, but it was a little too politically incorrect and had the potential to offend people. But, I think you have to think about who is the person. And there's some people you want to be polite to. Mm-hmm. There are going to be some people that you want to educate. And, I have a patient right now who is a sister-in-law who, I'm sorry, is a witch and is constantly, saying things to my patient about her children and her pregnancy, knowing that my patient's going through treatment for infertility. And so I've sort of given my patient permission to sort of zing her sister-in-law back and to try to shut her down. I think that's okay sometimes.
And you can plan ahead for a lot of these things. If you know you're going to a dinner, if you know you're going to a shower, if you know that you're going to a dinner where your younger sister who, is married for is going to announce a pregnancy, you plan. If you're partnered with someone and you're going to be going with your partner, you can have a plan. Like, if I squeeze your hand 3 times, you suddenly get sick in the bathroom and we need to go, or you get by work and there's a crisis and an emergency, or we have a flood in our apartment and we're leaving. Mm-hmm. And you have things that are prepared ahead of time that make you feel supported, that you're not in there alone and that you're going to be having to suffer through a situation that is going to make you want to be crying in the bathroom all night, because that, you have to plan ahead for these things.
I think the message we're trying to get across here is that you need to be self-protective.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You can't let other people say things to you that are going to keep you up all night. You need to figure out how to shut it down.
Yeah, and there's so much anxiety involved. If you even just the fact that you have a plan ahead, can relieve a lot of that, right? I think.
Well, I've also found most of my patients say if they plan ahead for all the things they're going to say back to zing people back, the people, of course, never say it. But at least you go to these events or functions feeling prepared.
It's better than going and having it said to you and just wanting to crumble and go home, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, but I think that, there's also, unfortunately, there's so much misleading information in the media. I was reading an article today on, I think it was CNN, that a 57-year-old woman in New Hampshire just had a baby. And and it never, ever mentioned that she used egg donation. And, for one of my patients, I remember, there've been so many celebrities over the last 30 years who've had babies via egg donation, which is a fabulous way to build their families, and, more power to them. But don't come out and say you spontaneously conceived at 57. It's just misleading. And then the problem is then every one of our patients, sisters, mothers-in-law, aunts, cousins, coworkers say, hey, look, you should go to that doctor because she was 57 and she got pregnant and you're 36, so you should be able to get pregnant too.
Or what's plenty of time?
As if you can't figure out what you need and you're,
Right.
Yeah. But I will also add that it's also completely normal to get triggered and fall apart. Like, we're trying to give people all the
and forgive yourself, right?
Try and help yourself, but it is 100% normal to be triggered at Thanksgiving dinner tables and at a baby shower and wherever you turn on a commercial or a TV show, and that is
in there.
Why we created the app, was to help with it, but not to tell people they should feel badly if they're experiencing these things and falling apart in the bathroom announcement, because that is what happens, you know.
Yeah. And
I don't think the general public understands how hard it is to go through infertility. I think they minimize it. And I think that we're finally now getting some data to show people how hard it is. I mean, this is a true life crisis.
right. And you can truly develop emotional, just not just, you know, like you can truly become depressed or become, you know, like take on, like, you know, it's a lot to take on. And things can come out of just having infertility that you never experienced before emotionally, obviously. And it's just,
Well, actually, the data actually shows that most women who are in treatment are anxious and depressed. And so in Liz's and my world, if someone's going through infertility and they're anxious and depressed, it means they're normal.
it's a much probably a way to look at it that might actually soothe you when you feel like you're
Right.
going crazy in your own head. I think it's interesting too that a lot of women find the barrage of social media, like we were talking about, so upsetting as you see pregnancy announcements and you see birth announcements and family photos. And then a lot of people create a separate account just kind of about their infertility and follow all, you know, fertility related kind of influencers and doctors and things like that. And I think that's, I mean, I don't know, is that something that you've seen with your patients and that you encourage to, it's like hard to stay off social media in this world, but maybe you kind of separate your worlds. So
I always tell people, if you feel better after a couple of days of not looking and scrolling down and seeing all of the photos and pregnancy announcements, the proof is in the pudding, right? That's like, you take care of yourself, feeling less depressed and less anxious. Just close it down for a while, shut it down, unplug. It's not worth it.
right. And again, it's just temporary. I know it feels weird not to be on social media, but it's just while you're going through this, right?
Well, and other people's pregnancies tend to be one of the most painful aspects of this all. And so, and people are going to post all the time. Or you can have a partner or a friend sort of monitor social media for you and, you know, delete or just warn you that someone you know is pregnant, so you're not shocked by it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've known friends that like turned magazines around at the grocery store and such, like, you know, just to make sure people didn't see things. So the real life version of that. And so we were talking about kind of when you're really on the same page with your partner and going into social situations together with a plan. But what about the situations where you may not be on the same page? Like there's the scenario where you and your partner might disagree about recommended next steps along your path. And that was one that has come up that we wanted to talk about. You could help us.
I've actually never, in my 30 something years of seeing couples, I have never seen a couple where the two of them are in the same place at the same time. And so I think
expect that in advance, right?
Absolutely. And, you know, and I'll sit down with a couple and I'll say, look, the way you're thinking and coping with your infertility is the right way for you. And the way your partner is thinking and coping with the infertility is the right way for your partner. But don't try to make them feel the same way you are.
Mm-hmm.
And people are going to be in a different place at different times. And, you know, in general, in a heterosexual couple, women tend to be a little ahead. Like they recognize it's a problem. They want to see a doctor. They want to move forward. But you never want someone to feel they're being held back, but you never also want someone to feel they're being pushed to make decisions they're not ready to make.
Yeah, it's about communication. I mean, you just have to learn to communicate. If it's about boundaries with family and friends, if it's with your partner, I think one of the hardest is the silver lining in all this, because people become amazing communicators. But It's so hard to learn how to set boundaries with family members and friends. People don't usually speak that candidly or directly with people about what they need. It's the same with partners. So a lot of what we do is counseling people and role playing and helping them figure out, first identify what your needs are. Sometimes we don't even know. You know, do I want out to me once do I want my partner to text me 3 times a day and ask me how I'm doing? Do I want the first question out of his or her mouth when they walk in the door to be, how was your day? Did you talk to your doctor? How are you feeling? Or sometimes people want to be left alone. They don't want people checking in, and no one is the same. So mind read, we can't pretend we know what the other person wants or feels. So a lot of it is just empathy training, communication training, you know, figure out what you need and want, and then learn how to communicate that very directly to the people in your lives that mean the most that you need it from. And then they can either give it to you or not. I always tell people in relationships, like, you can't get upset until you ask for what you need and then they fail to give it to you.
Right.
Like, first.
If it's not something you've gone through before, you might have dated for years, married now, but you didn't expect to have, struggle, building your family, and you might know exactly how each other operates, but now it's totally different, right? So
Absolutely.
Well, I think what's really important to remember is, as I said before, I think one of the hardest things for women is when someone else gets pregnant.
mm-hmm.
Men don't seem to have the same reaction. And so, if a couple is going through infertility and a friend gets pregnant, the female member of the couple may want to avoid any contact with that pregnant person. And her partner may say, your friend getting pregnant has nothing to do with our chances. I mean, the partner may be perfectly logical, but you see a huge amount of friction with couples.
Right.
Because she gets almost phobic about pregnancies and pregnancy announcements, and he's just not wired that way.
The other main friction,
and there's nothing wrong with her emotional reaction, even though his logical reaction is factual. So how do you help couples through a situation like that?
What I would say to the partner is, the way I'm sorry, the sun is coming. I don't know if you guys can see me.
It's like blowing on you. It's beautiful.
Our air conditioning is broken. I keep on trying to find the coolest place in our house.
Mm-hmm.
I think that if for example, if it's a heterosexual couple and the wife doesn't want to go to a party because it's being hosted by a couple where the wife is pregnant, and her husband is like, "What is wrong with you? Let's just go to the party and have fun." And I feel like I spend a lot of my time trying to educate partners about the psychological aspects of infertility and the fact that what his partner is experiencing is exactly normal. And that's how most people respond to infertility. And, it's interesting. And we run mind body groups. And one of the sessions, the partners come and then I'm going to move out of the sun so I don't look like I'm glowing. And for one of the sessions, we have the partners meet with a therapist. And it often turns into this sort of shock and awe kind of thing, because someone will say, my partner won't go to any function where there's a pregnant person. And all the other partners will go, really? I thought it was just my wife that was crazy. And so I think for them to hear that this is an entirely normal reaction in fertility improves their relationship. And as Liz says, can also improve communication.
And I think the other main source of tension in relationships is typically one partner wants to isolate a little bit more and pull away. Mm-hmm. And the partner's like, why? I don't understand. We're losing all of our friends. Like, why can't we go to this dinner party? Why can't we go to this party? And that's where you really need to negotiate too. Either that the partner that still desires those social connections still gets to go, but the one that feels that they need to isolate more and protect gets to stay. Mm-hmm. Or the other things we talked about, you negotiate, we can go, but I only want to stay for 30 minutes, or I want to stop by at the very end and just say hi, but then leave. So that's another we see people veer off, is being to tolerate social situations.
And making that plan in advance so you're not coming up to the event and still not on the same page, which causes more anxiety, right? Do you see couples often like together, but also recommend that they go separately and kind of have their own time in therapy? So they kind of can maybe speak more candidly as just maybe during the intense time of going through this journey?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'll see individuals and I'll see couples simultaneously. There are therapists. I don't even know, Liz, do you do that? Because there are a lot of therapists who won't see individuals if they're seeing the couple.
Yeah, I do if it's in the spirit of like helping the couple through the process. So you can kind of weave in and out of it. If it starts to feel like people need more intense individual sessions, sometimes you make a choice, like I'll treat you as a couple, but we need to now refer you out to separate people, or vice versa. Like I'll take one person and refer you to a couples therapist. But it's important for everyone to get the support they need, definitely.
Yeah. I think that's something that we hear so often. Like we've had a lot of these lives and we've talked about all different topics related to, the surrogacy journey or the legal components or, CPSA and like we've had so many of them, but it always comes back often to one of the top recommended pieces of advice is to make sure if you're not in therapy as you start this journey, get into it and plan to be in it throughout the journey and get the support you need, right? Even if it feels a little foreign, some people haven't done therapy before, but the emotional support is just so important, as well as helping you to make a plan and to work through it with your relationship.
Well, as I said, the research shows the majority of people going through infertility are anxious or depressed. And it's really hard to
just because
deal with it alone. I mean, Liz and I both belong to the mental health professional group of the American Society of Reproductive Medicine. So there are about 600 therapists in the U.S. who specialize in counseling individuals and couples going through the infertility challenge. And so I would strongly recommend, I do a training, and the first half day is the medical aspects of infertility. And the therapists say to me, why do we have to know the medical aspects of infertility? And I said, because our patients are so sophisticated and have had to learn so much about the medical aspects of infertility, they can't go see a therapist who knows nothing about it. Again, because I remember when I was first starting to run mind body groups, I was running them with someone who didn't know anything about infertility. And he said to me, well, these patients are just too depressed. We can't do group therapy with them. And I'm like, no, they're having an absolutely normal reaction to infertility because it's a life crisis.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. And we had another question that somewhat relates to this. For someone, for example, who deciding to freeze her eggs, someone wrote in about that. Just if you're about to make a big decision like this, that, obviously will bring about changes in your life, could bring on added stressors you might not be aware of. What should you be aware of? How do you prepare and kind of navigate when things come up that might be stressful or upsetting?
I mean, we could do a whole hour just on egg freezing and how to that and what comes up for that. I mean, that obviously is more and more common as it is, because 2012 it became non-experimental. So we
and last year there was quite a boom.
And the impact of COVID on people freezing eggs or just coming in to be more aggressive with treatment because of the feelings they had about COVID. I mean, there's so many places we could go with this, so many different things that have come up. Even recently, COVID has changed the whole landscape emotionally for so many people. I think, and Allie, I'd love for you to chime in too, with egg freezing, I think one of the biggest pieces that I see is that people have to grieve the loss of plan A while simultaneously feeling hopeful for plan B. So eggs is very empowering, even though it's not really an insurance policy, right? We don't know if it'll work and pay out. We have to be very careful that people understand that, because I think it's sold as an insurance policy, and that's not really truly, the case. But it is the only thing available to women to do if they want to preserve their fertility now, for whatever reason. They're pursuing their career. They just got out of a divorce or a breakup. They're just worried about if they wait any longer, they may need to not, turn to other means of having a child and not be able to have a genetic child of their own. So any of those things is a reminder of what they don't have right now, right? If it's because they haven't found Mr. Right, then it's a reminder of the fact that they're still haven't found Mr. Right. If they, were trying to focus on their career or education, it's a reminder of the fact that, oh gosh, maybe I made the wrong choice and I shouldn't have waited this long. So you're
going to your friends' weddings and just thinking about, I have to freeze my eggs. Right.
Yeah. Right. So you have to deal with the grief that comes along with not being where you thought you'd be at the given time that you're at, but also know that if you can get the support you need to get through the stress of making that decision, and you do decide to do it after obviously really thinking through it with your physician and getting all the facts, that it can be very, empowering at the same time. But I think people are caught off guard by the grief part of it.
I think some women are also unprepared, in effect, to become an infertility patient.
Yeah.
Because, I feel like I spend a lot of time with patients when they've decided to do an egg freeze cycle, and then it involves taking medication through injection. It involves, blood work. It involves ultrasounds. It involves an egg retrieval. And I think sometimes women they think of themselves as healthy young women, and they are healthy young women. And yet for a period of 10 or 12 days, they become a patient. And I think you have to sort of put that hat on for that short period of time.
Yeah, and that might be pretty jarring if, you've never been there before.
Right.
Even if you're like older or high risk, when you get pregnant, suddenly you have it's called a condition when you're AMA, or
I hate that.
geriatric at 35. Like all these little things can just feel like, just throw you off.
Right. Plus, medical terminology is horrible.
Yeah.
Advanced paternal age is ridiculous. I mean, if you think
about, you should rewrite a dictionary for.
They trying. They haven't come up with the right terms yet, but yes, it is.
Someone asked you about freezing their eggs at 38. So
I think they need an evaluation with a physician who can do blood work and an ultrasound to assess. The one thing I think that people don't talk about often enough is one thing that people do to assess sort of ovarian reserve is blood work, usually on day 3 of their cycle. And the problem is that those results of those blood tests solely predicts or has a correlation or relationship to how many eggs they're going to get if they do an IVF cycle. Mm-hmm. And so I've had a number of patients who wanted to do egg freezing and their quote unquote day 3 bloods were not ideal. And so their physician recommended against them doing egg freezing. But I had to, convince them that doesn't mean they're infertile. I didn't want them to go and have a one-night stand and get pregnant. And so, the research shows this ovarian reserve testing predicts response to treatment, not necessarily response to sperm.
Okay.
The other thing to know is that you need a certain number of eggs to have a certain percentage chance of being able to have those eggs translate into a baby later, right? They have to survive the thawing process. They have to be able to fertilize. They have to be able to implant, result in a pregnancy. And so I think a lot of people feel like I'll just go freeze some eggs. And then, if I get 10 eggs, I have 10 chances of a baby later. That's not how it works. And so whether, 28 or 35 or 40, that's a conversation to have with your REI and to understand that it may take more than one cycle, depending on what your reserve is. And you can be a 38-year-old that has an ovarian reserve more like a 32-year-old, and you can be a 32-year-old that looks more like a 40-year-old. So it's really discussions. And, you can wind up needing to do several cycles to get to a number that winds up giving you the percentage chance that makes sense for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, this goes back, there's a comment we have in here about how important it is to work with a therapist that's trained in infertility. If you don't, they just this medical background, if they don't have that and help you prepare for what you might encounter and what your number of eggs might mean for you, like it, you need that background to help someone through it and kind of predict what they might emotionally go through, based on their outcomes, right?
I mean, a therapist has to know the medical aspects.
Yeah.
So, if a patient walks into my office and says, her AMH was less than 0.1, I know what that means. And so I can appropriately counsel, as could Liz. But if they're going to see a therapist off the street, they may have no idea what that means. And I think that, as I said, our patients are so sophisticated because they spend so much time researching infertility that the people they work with have to match their knowledge base or hopefully know a little bit more.
Well, sometimes they get completely inaccurate information. Yeah. What we know the research really shows. Like if you talk about donor egg and disclosure to offspring, I mean, there's so many therapists that aren't trained in this area that say, oh, you should never tell, or you should tell, and they don't understand the nuances involved in this field in all aspects, from egg freezing, miscarriage, on to donor egg and expanding their family in all sorts of ways.
Mm-hmm. We've had another scenario that's come up in the past. I'm wondering if you've had patients go through this. I'm sure you have, but intended mothers who go through IVF for a first journey and then go through several cycles for a second one and it doesn't work and end up having to move on to surrogacy. And you kind of go from being the patient to being the intended parent. It's almost like you're sitting on the sidelines, like the way your husband must feel seeing you as a patient and not feeling as much in control. Is that's just a specific scenario, but is that something you've helped people through? And like, I don't know.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've had a number of patients who had biological children through their own pregnancy who then had to move on to donor egg or then had to move on to gestational surrogacy. And I think you're always trying to focus on the end game, the fact that you want to parent another child, and how that child comes into the world is somewhat less important than the fact that you're going to parent this child for the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm. And I'll just add that what can feel like medically the next hop, skip, and a jump, like the doctors are doing their job saying like, okay, well, so here's the next options for you. Emotionally does not happen as fast, right? So it's, okay, let's just move on to donor egg. No one wakes up one morning and says, let's go get a carrier or do donor egg.
Right.
Psychologically, this takes a long time to reconcile and grieve and make peace with and get to a point of choosing or not choosing those paths. You also mentioned secondary infertility. I mean, that's another area that is really hard for people. The research and experience shows that the suffering that is involved with secondary infertility is just as intense as trying your first time. But people often don't really give the compassion and empathy to someone who already has a child. And that can leave that person feeling incredibly isolated. I don't really fit in the support groups. I don't really fit in with my fertile friends, my non-fertile friends. So it's very hard.
I'm sure.
I mean, you know, I think people, I agree with Liz, is that I happen to have a number of secondary patients right now, and they don't get any, they don't fit anywhere. They don't fit in the sort of in the primary infertility world, and they don't fit in the fertile world. They're sort of straddling, and they just don't feel like they fit in. And yet you know, they can't escape the child world. They are very nervous about the age difference between their children, and they know what it's like to parent. And so, you know, I think people assume if you have one child and you have secondary infertility, it's not nearly as bad. The research shows it's just as bad.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many components to that, right? It's like your first child might keep getting their hopes up, and how do you communicate if you're going through loss with a child, right? And maybe having to give up and make the choice to have a single child in the end, or just keep trying for years and have that big age gap you didn't expect. It can be shocking when it's easy to get pregnant the first time and then it's not the second, you know.
Well, I have a patient right now who has a child and then had a second trimester loss. So the child knew her mother was pregnant. And so not only is my patient and her husband mourning, but they're having to handle the distress of their child, who desperately wanted a sibling. And so every day this child says, you know, when are you going to get pregnant again? And if you think it's bad to have a mother-in-law ask you that, think about what it's like to have a 4-year-old ask you that.
Yeah, it's definitely a very specific scenario that it just really helps to have a plan for, especially how to communicate to your child, right? So
but I think the sort of takeaway message is, this is really hard. And what you want to do as you go through this journey, no matter how you're trying to build your family, you need to avail yourself of every possible resource that you think is going to work for you. Whether it's individual therapy or couples therapy or the Furticom app or joining a support group, whatever, you know, take it all in.
Yeah, and for those who are adverse to therapy, who feel like, oh, it's just not my thing, or they have a partner who really doesn't want to, you know, sometimes it just takes 1 or 2 sessions. This doesn't really have to mean you're going to be in therapy for like 1 to Sometimes it's just psychoeducation. Like what you're feeling is completely normal. Here's participate as you go through the process. And sometimes that's enough. Just knowing like, okay, so we're not crazy. What we're feeling is valid. And now we know what to participate so we could start to prepare for it. And for some couples and individuals, that's all they need. So we don't mean to suggest that by any means every single person has to be getting support throughout the entire process, but it can be very helpful for many to do that, or just 1 or 2 sessions just to kind of get a sense of where they're at in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of our final questions you kind of already answered perfectly, just about, like you said, the final takeaway, your final kind of words of advice or words of wisdom for those just beginning this family building journey. So I also just wanted to make, you know, everyone aware that we also did an interview with Liz and Allie on our blog. And there's a quote there that kind of relates to what we've talked about today, which I think is a good balance between realistic and hopeful. And it's that anyone just beginning the journey needs to be aware that it can be a bumpy road. Most people do experience some anxiety, distress, and irritability. The stakes are high. But one also has to be aware that there are so many things you can do to decrease that distress. You are climbing a mountain with the most amazing gift at the top, a healthy baby. So thank you for that, and, you know, for everything you shared today and everything that you do to help people get to the top of that mountain. Is there anything else you want to share that you're excited about coming up for you two or Furticom? Oh, my dog just joined. Sorry.
I see that. You know, I think, you know, our latest project, you know, Furticom came out about 3 or 4 years ago, and we completely revamped it, and it came out 4 months ago as Furticom Pro. But what Liz and I are actually working on now is we're hoping to be a new app called Furtiqueer for the LGBTQ plus community who are trying to build a family, because there's literally no resources out there to deal with the anxiety, stress, distress, discrimination, discomfort that the LGBTQ population faces. And so, we're looking for funding opportunities or someone to sponsor the development of the app, because we think it's really necessary. Everyone we talk to gets really excited about it. And
so if anyone wants to fund Furtiqueer, message us. We'll pass it along.
Absolutely,
yeah. Or if you want to do pro bono app development work, or if your husband, anyone, your partner does, let them know. I think that's a good takeaway.
Not that I want to solicit, but we're really excited about it. We have writers, we have everyone lined up. We just need the funding. Yeah,
and we want to help provide that resource. So we really hope that turns out. And then thanks again to those of you who submitted questions before and during the conversation, and just for joining. And thank you so much, Liz and Allie, and for getting into the room. Eventually we made it work, right?
Thank you, Rebecca, for organizing this. I know it took a lot of hard work. We really appreciate you're giving us a chance to try to provide some comfort to your community.
Yeah, and we will get through this, and use every resource that works for you at your disposal, right? So
keep on climbing.
Mm-hmm. And if you do have more questions you think of after this, feel free to message us or to Furticom right on Instagram, right? Hopefully that works.
Yep.
And if you have other topics you want to hear about in these lives, let me know. We always try to do topics that you guys are interested in. So thank you to everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Stay healthy, everybody.
Bye.
Good luck.
Thank you. You too.
Bye.